Space. Reality. It's not a linear path. It's a prism of endless possibility, where a single choice can branch out into infinite realities, creating alternate worlds from the ones you know. From a low-down to a plus-up, follow me and ponder the question.
What the heck?
Hello and welcome to The Lowdown on the Plus Up, a podcast where we look at everyone's favorite theme park attractions, lands, textures, and novelties. We talk in, over, about, and through our week's topic, and then, with literally no concern for practicality, safety, or economic viability, we come up with ways to make them better. My name is Kelly McCubbin, columnist for the theme park website Boardwalk Times, and with me, as always, is Peter Overstreet, University Professor of Animation and Film History in Northern California. So, Pete.
Yeah.
What are we talking about today?
Well, today we're going to kind of do a nice little retrospective of a park that I've always had a soft spot for this place. Because I remember growing up as a kid, watching these cartoons, just falling in love with these wild and crazy situations and being blown away by it. And it wasn't everybody's cup of tea. But actually, a lot more people are into this than you might think.
Yeah.
And sadly, the park no longer exists.
Right.
We're going to talk about Fleischerland.
Fleischerland, yeah. Down in Florida.
Yep.
You know, Fleischerland closed in 1983.
Yeah.
So it's faded a little from popular culture now.
Yeah.
But it is hard to overstate how popular those cartoons were.
Oh, yeah.
And how big a deal it was.
Oh, and the park. I mean, I remember being absolutely brokenhearted. They did a special. I think they actually had Danny Kaye, Stephen, Edie Allen were on there. Like, it was crazy. And I remember just being brokenhearted when they did this whole thing where Heather O'Rourke, you remember the kid from Poltergeist?
Oh, gosh,
girl?
yeah.
They're here. She's like gonna go wandering up to the gates of the park, and they do this really like nasty thing where they close the gates on her, and I was just like, what are you doing?
Were those the like closing ceremonies?
Kind of. It was like it was like a sneak preview of what was to come. Like, you only have one more year, so you better go to the park and get it out of your system because we're shutting down. And I remember just being brokenhearted. I mean, I went the last year.
Did you?
I did. I begged my parents.
How was it then? Was it a little more ramshackle, a little more run down, or was it going strong to the end? Because I know the reason that Fleischerland kind of broke down eventually was the Fleischer brothers, and for those who aren't aware, the Fleischer brothers they're Betty Boop, they're Coco the Clown, they're Popeye, they're the original Superman cartoons, they're all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. And, but the brothers always warred. They were always at each other's throats. And by the time the last of the brothers, Dave Fleischer, passed away in 1979, the estates just couldn't settle anything, and it tore the park.
Yeah, I think was it Max's son?
Richard.
Yeah. Richard. I mean, he was more of a film director.
Yeah.
He had made the Vikings with Kirk Douglas and Ernest Borgnine. And the same year that the park closed, out comes, I think he was in production on a Conan the Barbarian movie or something.
That's right. Was it the sequel?
Yeah, the
Conan the Destroyer. Yeah,
which was in itself is like a Betty Boop cartoon, only with muscles
and Grace Jones,
which is like wow. Yeah. So, but he wasn't really up for running the park. I think he was just more of a filmmaker and just didn't really want anything to do with it. And I think the writing was on the wall. I remember being a kid and just loving it because that was my one and only trip. Now, my parents had gone, and I had heard tons of stories about the place because we had grown up with this type of entertainment.
Right.
But I only got to go this one time. Mm-hmm. And we stayed at the Inkwell Hotel, which is right around the corner. You have to take a tram to it because that place was huge.
It was huge.
It was huge. A lot of square footage out there in Orlando.
Yeah.
I do remember walking through. I always wondered if it was just Florida. But
Florida was just Inkwell land.
Yeah, it wasn't awful. But you could definitely tell that there was some stuff that was just kind of like, yeah, we're just not going to bother painting this anymore.
Yeah.
We're just not going to, but it wasn't awful, but it was enough where even a 9-year-old who was totally enamored with all the characters and the fun of the place was like, they should paint that. But you can kind of tell that, like, that costs money, we're kind of done.
It was being
just buy your bimbo hat and just move on. I still have my bimbo hat. That thing is.
Oh, with the big ears?
The big ears,
yeah.
The big ears.
And I always wonder, like, how do you know with the hats? Because I've seen them and they're a little bit generic. It's like, how do you know if it's bimbo or Fitz or Pudgy?
Well, with Pudgy, it was white. With one little black ear.
Yes.
And
that's right.
And the little emblem in the front squeaked. That actually had like his little picture of Pudgy in the front. You could push it and it went because it was meant for little kids, right? The Pudgy hat. And Pudgy hats are really hard to find because the squeakers have broken over time.
Yeah.
And the material was kind of that woven. The actual hat itself was actually like a woven mesh because kids, running around, they didn't want it to breathe.
Yeah.
But like the front squeaked and it was really cute. And I really wanted a Pudgy hat because I love Pudgy. But I gave in and I had a bimbo hat with my name embroidered on the side.
Oh, that's awesome.
It was pretty great.
Yeah. Do you still have it?
I do have it. It got flattened after all my moves, sure. But it's still there. The little felt, the heavy felt ears are kind of bent and kind of flattened, but I still have it. All the elastics all worn away.
Well, so we've jumped kind of to the sad end of the park. Let's back up a little bit and talk about how the Fleischers kind of got to the point where they had enough influence and enough money to actually build this thing that no one had ever seen anything like it before.
Mm-hmm. So long before the park opened in 1955.
Yeah.
The Fleischers were one of several animation houses that were growing all over America in the 1920s, where you have cartoons like Felix the Cat.
Yeah.
And you obviously have cartoons like Bimbo the Dog and Coco the Clown with the Fleischers. Mm-hmm. And you also have Harvey Toons also kind of playing around a little bit here with their it's more experimental at this time. They're not really taking off. But the big one, the Fleischers had a competitor that not a lot of people know about.
Yeah.
They know about him, but he's kind of like this. They go, oh yeah,
it's culty now.
It's culty. It's very niche-y. Like you can still find memorabilia in like antique stores, but it's mostly on like really bad, clocks and antique cookie tins and stuff.
Right.
But it was a cartoonist named Walt Disney.
Right. Yeah.
And Walt and his brother Roy Disney, these two guys started off doing these things that they called laugh-o-grams, which are these really they're terrible. The laugh-o-grams were basically almost like advertisements for local businesses.
Right.
And they started off in the Midwest. These two enterprising kids, they were kind of hucksters. And they were kind of, their dad was a contractor. Mm-hmm. And mom was very, very devoted to him. But Walt especially was kind of a con man. He could really talk his way into just about anything.
Yeah.
And he managed to make these laugh-o-grams and get enough money. And then I guess the business failed or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
And they moved on to do cartoons. They decided to try their hand and move the entire business to Los Angeles, which is insane.
Well, the interesting thing that you run into with the Disney character and then the Fleischers, and then to an extent like Otto Mesmer and Felix the Cat, is that they were pretty fierce competitors.
Oh, big time.
Felix died out pretty quickly because the guy that owned the company, Pat O'Sullivan, I believe, was an abusive alcoholic guy and just ran it into the ground. And Otto Mesmer was kind of the only person who could pull it off. And so that character, even though he stayed around in some way or another for a long time, he wasn't nearly as big a deal.
Yeah.
But Walt Disney's mouse characters, he had kind of a whole barnyard crew.
I got to say, before you go into that, I have to say say, like, the people who are really into Disney cartoons, they're charming, but the ones that really stand out to me, like, he was just starting to come up with this one character, and I love this character because he's so quirky and so different from the rest of the Disney oeuvre, was Donald Duck. This kind of, and when you really think about it, he's this jerk. Like, he's constantly causing problems, and yet there's something about him that has more appeal than anything else that these Disney animators were doing at the time, that by the time he finally got to color, it was like, oh my goodness, here's this opportunity for the superstar. And then the whole thing falls apart. And it's like this promise of possibility with Donald Duck as a potential character.
I should see if I can go.
Oh my God, you should
back
totally
and
see
find some of these.
That's the one concession I do have to Disney collecting. I have a tiny little couple of things of Donald Duck.
Yeah.
Because I guess Disney actually tried his own hand at marketing, kind of following in Max Fleischer's footsteps of actually trying to put Donald Duck on various products. And I guess he had orange juice put out. It's like, why would a duck sell orange juice? So I have this, like this, the oldest thing I've got is this Donald Duck orange juice tin for concentrate from the Depression. It's like the stupidest thing. It's like, why would you have? But as an animation professor, I just have it as like this quirky, like, guess what? This is a failed attempt at marketing, kid. Like, there's no way that Disney could build a brand. There was just no way it could happen. For him.
And it was interesting too because I've looked into this a bit, and there was a point where it seemed like Disney might be the animation studio that was going to take off.
Yeah.
Like they were really making some moves. And the Fleischers were very popular because they'd started off with their very famous Out of the Inkwell cartoons with Coco the Clown and Bimbo. And then had come up with Betty Boop, who obviously is Betty Boop. It's the biggest cartoon star of all time.
Absolutely.
Maybe. And so they were kind of clashing. And a couple of things happened that I learned about that were this sort of linchpin where the Fleischers sort of leapfrogged over. They were two things. One of them had to do with the Hollywood Code, the Hays Code.
Of course it did.
Yeah, and one of them had to do with the introduction of color.
Yeah.
I'll do the code first.
Okay, please.
So the Hays Code was instituted supposedly to kind of clean up movies, which were starting to get a little racy come 1929, 1930.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what they were supposed to do.
Sure.
Really, there was some racism and there's some anti-Semitism in the Hays Code.
Oh,
And Will Hays was a difficult character.
To say the least.
Yeah. But the Fleischer studios, the Fleischer family, they were Jewish. They immigrated from Krakow. The two eldest brothers, Max and Charles Fleischer, literally were born in Krakow.
Wow.
And the Hays Code really started to come down on them, and it seemed like Disney was about to go by them because of this really horrible racist reason. And then Hollywood turned around. Something happened, like a spark of intelligence happened, and people began to see through this thing. And they denounced Will Hays, and the code was wiped out. And that moment right there maybe saved the Fleischer Studios.
I'd say so. I mean, the Fleischers had kind of an odd ally through a distributor who they were trying to work with at the time.
Yeah.
And it's weird because they never actually wound up working with them. But along comes this one ally from out of the side. So they were networking like crazy, the Fleischers.
Yeah.
Especially with the New York scene. Because at the time, you had two schools of filmmaking. You had the New York set and you had the California set.
Yeah.
And the New Yorkers were really bunching together. They were really, really pulling together to go against Will Hays. And one of the big proponents who actually had a lot of clout was working on a film that he desperately wanted to have some imagery in it that was very questionable. And even though later on this film that he was working on would also be accused of some racist tones and some symbolism.
Yeah.
If he hadn't done so, if he hadn't stood up, I really think that this guy came in heavy-handed because this guy was a powerhouse. This guy was like a war hero. He had piloted a plane. He had been shot down a couple of times and then survived and then killed like his German guards and escaped by hand, and then he made these these adventure movies. And the one that he made that he wanted, like he actually wanted some nudity in, I mean, tasteful, but still, you got jungle nudity, was King Kong. And the guy was Marion C. Cooper, who was on the executive board of RKO Pictures.
Yeah.
And at the time, you also had people like Howard Hughes, who was also getting railed against by the big Hollywood engine for making movies like The Outlaw.
Right.
And so he also was like, I don't want to deal with the Hays Code. So these guys really banded together. I mean, they could have splintered off and they could have gotten to this infighting, which I think the people behind the Hays Code were actually trying to bet on.
I think so too. Yeah. And I think they were looking at people like Howard Hughes is a great example. They were looking at people like Hughes and saying, well, he's going to let us persecute this group of people because it will get rid of some competitors. Yeah. But that's not what happened.
No, there was some really odd solidarity. And I think a lot of it had to do with almost all of these people were outsiders in some way or another. The Fleischers being immigrants. Yeah. Howard Hughes having his own kind of neurospiciness. Yeah. And also being an outsider, even in Hollywood and even as a oil drill bit maker, where he made his millions initially and then eventually would start making, movies like Hell's Angels. Right. You really see that the people that fought against the Hays Code were like these Hollywood outsiders that just came out of the blue and fought back against the bully. Yeah. And that's what's weird. It's
I mean, Marion C. Cooper is a perfect example too. Like absolutely fiercely independent character.
Oh, big time, big time. He was a little man with a huge chip on his shoulder. Yeah. So just don't tell him that he doesn't get to do anything. Yeah. Which is interesting because Marion C. Cooper actually led to be a proponent of another factor that Kelly and I actually think was a contribution to the rise of the Fleischer Studios, which was the advent of 3-strip Technicolor.
That's right. Yeah. Because there was an earlier 2-strip version. Yep. That you saw, and I think King of Jazz is maybe the most famous example of it. It doesn't look good.
No, the first 2-strip Technicolor was an Anime Wong film. Oh, and which was supposed to be a big vehicle for it. It was an independent film because, it was an experiment. So right. I think the thinking is that I think it was because it was a film that they felt like no one was going to pay attention to. So they did this. And for those who don't know what 2-strip Technicolor is.
I've seen this film. It's a silent film. Yeah. I wish I could remember what it's called. Like she falls in love with a soldier.
It's kind of a retelling of Madame Butterfly.
Yeah. Yeah. And then he leaves and she ends up having children. It's very surprisingly racy.
So the 2-strip Technicolor process works like this. They're basically two images are taken simultaneously by being split through a prism, printing it for a green and a red, and that's it. There's no yellow. And they're filmed head to head. They're flipped. So one is flipped over the other. And that's when it's in its negative form. Yeah. When it is processed, they are glued together, kind of like a zigzag. Yeah. Literally glued together with a solvent between the two strips. And so that's why it's called 2-strip Technicolor, because these strips are then taken apart, spliced together, and turned into this combination of additive color of red and green. And so a lot of these films of 2-strip Technicolor, you can see them. The surviving ones, they look a little off. Yeah. And it's because there's no yellow into the mix. It's not cyan and magenta. There's just no yellow.
But I think the interesting thing that then happens is Technicolor comes up with this 3-strip process, which is much, much better. And they're trying to get some people to test it out. Yeah. And they decide that it's not quite ready for live action movies, but they're going to talk to the animation studios. They end up talking to Walt Disney.
Well, talking to is a weird thing. He somehow conned his way in. talk to them. Let's be honest here. But anyway, go ahead.
Right. And he wanted to take the process and make it exclusive.
Yeah.
So that he had full rights, and his biggest competitor, the Fleischers, didn't. And Technicolor just refused. They said, no, we're not going to do that. So ultimately, both studios got the 3-strip Technicolor at the same time, which again didn't give the advantage to the other studio.
Yep. There's another thing that happened. There's another thing that happened here, which is Walt Disney had an animator that would eventually go working for the Fleischers. This guy was very akin to the Fleischers. I mean, I think he resonated with the Fleischers more than Walt.
Okay.
And the reason is because he was an inventor. He was, the Fleischers were inventors. The whole family were always tinkering with something.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
And we'll get into that in a minute.
Yeah.
But this guy had worked for Walt for a short period of time and then had butted heads with him so much that he just packed his bags and left and literally went across country straight over to Miami to work for the Fleischers.
Yeah.
And his name was Ub Iwerks. And Ub, taking off I think it kind of threw Disney, because I think he was like, oh, well, I've got this ace in the hole. I've got this fabulous animator. Whereas Ub's like, I'm going where I'm going to be best treated, man.
Yeah.
So off he went. And so there was this big push to combine music and the visual medium.
Yeah.
Using animation, kind of like a music video. And Disney was trying to go the more classical route. But I don't think that I don't think America was really up for that. I think they were right in the middle of the Depression. People were really starting to resonate with this new music form called jazz.
Yeah. Let's face it, America at that point, they wanted jazz more than they wanted classical music.
Yes.
And they wanted Cab Calloway.
Mm-hmm.
And
boy, did they get it.
Yeah.
Through an invention, by the way. It was very early. I think it was 1917 or something like that. He had a patent on a machine and a process that he referred to as rotoscoping. And so he utilized this process very heavily. He actually filmed Cab Calloway and rotoscoped Cab's movements as he's doing his kind of cool jazzy dance.
Yeah, which Pete is doing live.
I'm doing this right wiggle in my chair, folks, here's the story about Minnie the Moocher. And apparently Cab Calloway was just blown away. He thought this was the best ever.
The Lowdown on the Plus Up is a Boardwalk Times podcast. At boardwalktimes.net, you'll find some of the most well-considered and insightful writing about the Walt Disney Company, Disney history, and the universe of theme parks available anywhere. Come join us at boardwalktimes.net. Feature films, massively successful feature films. Most of the animation talent had moved over to them. So there was this incredible sophistication in the work that they were doing. And come, the early to mid 50s, the Fleischer Studios were the place to be.
Absolutely. I mean, let's talk really briefly about one of the things, because Fleischer today, it's not a theme park. It still exists. The company still does exist.
Yeah.
But it's not a theme park company. It's a movie production company, and they do a lot of television and streaming and that kind of stuff. So it is still entertainment, but they're mostly there to acquire, properties and distribute. That's all they really do. They're not really the production house that they once were.
Right.
That doesn't mean that they're not powerful and they still don't hold sway.
Yeah.
The Fleischer entertainment medium, we're not talking about that. We're talking about this earlier era. So when we talk about Fleischer, for those who are thinking of fondly, we're going to talk about the nostalgic Fleischers.
Yeah, right.
You had mentioned where the Fleischers grew up in Brooklyn, New York.
Yeah, Brownsville.
Brownsville.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. There was another group of brothers that grew up in Brownsville.
Yep.
And tell us who they were, Kelly.
Why, they were the Howards and the Fines. as we know them, the Three Stooges.
Oh man,
at the same time grew up in Brownsville as same time as the Fleischer brothers did.
Wow.
I guess we can go ahead and jump into the park a little bit.
Oh yeah,
now.
We can
because the Fleischers, they decided they were going to branch out a little bit. They decided they were going to try and do something with the amusement park idea.
Yeah,
that was just a little bit hipper. It was just a little bit more of the times. It wasn't like old carny hucksters. It was going to have some jazz, and it was going to have some kind of weird anthropomorphized nonsense going on everywhere. And so they put together Fleischerland. And, it took a couple of years. It opened in 1955.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you know how he started it, right? You've heard the story.
Mm-mm.
Well, I'm sure all you Fleischer heads out there will probably know this one, but I'm going to repeat it anyway for those who don't know. The whole idea apparently came out of when Max was actually taking his son, Richard.
Yeah.
Who was at the time the theme park. It was a filmmaker. The filmmaker was a little boy, was taking him to Nathan's Hot Dogs off of Coney Island, and they're standing out there and they're sitting there eating their hot dogs. They're eating their Nathan's Hot Dogs, having a great time out there in Coney Island, and they're watching the cyclone going like crazy.
Yep.
But the problem is, there's all of these. At this point, it was kind of seedy.
Yeah.
It was really starting to show its age. It was no longer the glory of Luna Park that it once was.
Yeah.
And Max was like, there's got to be a place where we can still have the flavor of New York without it having the filth of New York.
Right. Yes.
He wanted to be safe for his son, but growing up in Brownsville, it's like, it was a melting pot of personalities, cultures, and people.
There were some wonderful communities there.
Oh, you had the Jewish population, you had the Italian population, you have African-American population is all in there. And it literally is this kind of American, like, veritable melting pot. I know that's kind of a weird, controversial phrase to use these days, but it kind of was. And that's how Max felt about it. But you couldn't deny that it was a rough place to grow up in.
Oh, yeah.
You just can't, you couldn't do that. So, eventually he would no longer live in New York.
Yeah.
Because, they would wind up with the whole situation where the cartoonists unionized because I think Max was getting a little too wealthy and a little too hoity-toity, and the brothers were like, I don't know what to do. So even though they did unionize, they kind of found a way how to get around some of the more strident laws by moving the production down to Florida. That's where... On a trip through the Everglades, they were just like going around on a fan boat, and Max got this idea like, oh man, this is the place to be. And it's kind of appropriate, It's like the guy behind Popeye the Sailor, and all these other kind of trippy cartoons goes like, let's take this swamp and turn it into something amazing. Okay. But so that's why he did it, is because he had moved the entire staff down to Miami, and he was like, I'm going to go on a trip with my kid. We're going to go out to Orlando just to kind of go fishing and have a good time out in the Everglades. And he went, let's do it. And so he came up with it. Like, I want to do a Coney Island in Florida is basically all he boiled it down to.
But boy, did it get bigger.
Well, his brother hated it. His brother hated this idea so much.
Dave,
Dave, because he had two brothers, right? He
had 5, or he had 4 brothers.
Wow.
Charles is the oldest. Max is the second oldest.
Wow. That's so cool. I think what the nice thing about Fleischerland is that it was kind of an ideal situation for him.
Yeah. Yeah.
He had actually sold the rights off. So we'll get into this in a minute, but he basically sold off the rights to some properties that he was working on he just didn't want to deal with anymore.
Yeah.
And it was like all these obscure characters, and he handed it off. Nobody did anything with him, but he took that money and used that to buy real estate. He was like, I'm just going to get rid of the trash. Somebody else, like, this is how rich this guy is.
Yeah.
And how powerful he is as an artist. Like, here, take my garbage, and now I'm going to use that to buy real estate.
Right.
Right. So he buys all this real estate in the Everglades, and he builds it up.
Yeah.
And he starts designing the park in 1953.
Yeah.
One of the designers was Ubiworks, because he was like getting tired of being an animator. I mean, he's already in his late 50s at this point. He's kind of starting to slow down. He's raising his own family of iWorkses.
Well, and let's face it, he fits in beautifully here because he also is a bit of an inventor.
Yes, he is.
Ubiworks is a guy who is putting together new kinds of cameras. He's inventing new kinds of film technologies. And this, of course, is Max's strength. This is what Max sees. Max invents rotoscope or co-invents rotoscope. He invents the idea of like three-dimensional animation with his giant turntables.
He also invented the follow the bouncing ball as you sing.
That's right.
Which I think he saw a kinship to Ub, because Ub's main contribution, besides being a genius animator, was the one time that Walt actually built Max to the punch.
Yeah.
Which was this cartoon called Steamboat Willie, in which it was the first time you had, I forget what it was called, Vitascope or something.
Yeah.
And it was the one time where you actually had sound. So it was the first sound cartoon.
Yeah.
That didn't, that was simultaneous, but it was actually built off of a bouncing ball principle. So I think Max and Oob kind of went, oh yeah, I had that same idea at the same time.
Yeah.
I mean, even though Max was kind of like, okay, Walt, I'll give you that one. You got sound on me. Now I'm going to go nuts with this. I got color, But
so you've got those two inventors, plus you've got the eldest brother, Charles Fleischer, who was not that involved in the movies, but was an inventor. And by the time they started on this theme park idea, also was kind of the level-headed guy.
Yeah.
Do you know the interesting thing, and this will come into play a little bit later, the interesting thing that Charles Fleischer invented that we still see everywhere today?
No.
He invented the claw machine. that amusement park staple where you put a quarter in or whatever and turn the knobs and you try and get the claw to pull out your stuffy or whatever.
It's in every Denny's lobby everywhere.
Yeah, and Charles Fleischer actually invented that. And, interestingly enough, he nearly lost his shirt over it because it was extremely popular. They're making a fortune off of them, but after he had invented it in the 20s, New York State decided they were going to have a serious crackdown during Prohibition on gambling.
Right.
And they considered those claw machines gambling devices.
Oh, because it is a chance.
It's a game of chance, right.
Oh,
and so there was a story that I read where the police were actually coming to the warehouse where they were making these things.
Oh, my God.
And someone gave Charles Fleischer a little heads up. And so he had a bunch of boys come in, a bunch of his Brownsville boys come in and smash every single machine to pieces, so that they couldn't produce a full one to use in evidence against him.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
That
and of course,
so
now we think nothing of those things.
Well, the same year, out comes, of all things, Popeye versus Sinbad the Sailor, which just kills.
Right.
And they actually made like a special Oscar for it.
Yeah, because it wasn't actually a full feature.
Yeah, it wasn't a full feature, but they did make a special Oscar for it. Like Shirley Temple came out and presented this special Oscar, and it was 3 Oscars, one in a row, and one was shaped like Popeye, had like the big bulky arms, and one was like shaped like Bluto, and one was this tall, skinny one like Olive Oil. It was hilarious. These solid gold statues. And he thought it was hilarious because it caught on so much. I mean, spinach sales went through the roof that year, and spinach was hard to come by because this is the Depression.
Right,
We're just kind of coming out of it, but like spinach farming suddenly became like very on vogue, and that's when I think Fleischer just really cemented itself as the big powerhouse. That is what leads to his fortune. He's building up his fortune with all of these different media formats, but for him, being the inventor, he's constantly coming up with new things.
Yeah.
And he started tinkering with automatons.
Yeah, like weird robots.
Weird robots. And he actually came up with a new phrase, which wasn't all that original. He called them rotomatons at first.
That didn't stick.
That didn't stick too well. It's kind of like, okay, Max, okay, not that.
Stretching it, yeah.
You're stretching it. But his designers, at the theme park, basically that was kind of the beginnings of what we now call rotomatronics. And Rotomatronics was like his
Right.
playing around with like little wooden, because he was always fascinated by the fortune-telling machines at Coney Island and that kind of stuff. It becomes this pursuit of creation, imagination, and invention, which is really fascinating about Fleischerland.
To kind of get us back, because I think the place that we start with Fleischerland, the two main areas there are both Rotomatronic attractions.
Yeah.
Used to, before the park closed down, when you entered Fleischerland, you entered Brownsville Boulevard.
Oh, yeah.
Which was a recreation of the childhood neighborhood that the Fleischers and the Three Stooges grew up on.
Just slightly cleaner. but
more
but
than
still,
slightly, probably.
Yeah, more than slightly. But still, it was Brownsville. It had all the great landmarks. It had the open market grocery stores.
That's right. And there was like clotheslines hanging overhead. And you could hear cantors singing off in the distance. The food was delis. And a
lot of delightful multicultural foods to pick from.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't just mom and apple pie Americana. I think Americans were kind of like done with that. It was like, no, you get to have borscht.
Oh.
Like they're really like, what? Like
you get it like with a raw egg in it. And
hardcore, like borscht. And you're like, in a theme park? Like, I can understand, kishkas, like kids, they would actually have like kishkas. So you actually have like a big sausage. It's like that was their thing. I'm going to get a giant kishka, like that's so great. A pickle and a kishka. That's so great. So.
Yeah. And there are two big attractions. When Brownsville Boulevard first opened up, there wasn't a lot. It was mostly the shopping, the delis, the sound effects and stuff. After a while, after Max started to develop the Rotomatronics, they started being able to put some interesting shows in. And there's two shows that really held sway on Brownsville Boulevard. One of them was a show that featured this interesting combination of animation and Rotomatronics and live actors. And it was called Apple for the Teacher. And it was such a great show. Like the entire theater was designed like a giant not a giant class, like a classroom, like an old 1920s classroom. And the audience sat at desks. And the teacher turned out to be an animated in the front of the theater, Betty Boop.
Oh, wow.
And then you began to discover that some of your classmates were the Three Stooges.
Okay.
And so, the whole gimmick of it is that the Stooges are trying to flirt with their teacher. And end up doing the Stooge thing together. Wonderful little show.
Is that where the song comes, the B-A-B, B-A-B?
It is. B-I-B. That's exactly where that came from. Yeah.
Oh, my God.
It ended up being so popular for them later.
Yeah. People whistle that song. They don't even realize what it's from. I had no idea.
Yeah, and there's some
I've seen pictures of it, but I never got to see that because I think it had been transformed to something else, but it sounds amazing.
Oh, so much fun. And the live actors, there was some very, very rudimentary Rotomatronics. So most of the work was done by actual actors.
Right.
But interacting with animation on the walls around you. So much fun. There's a story, and I don't know if this is true, but maybe. There's a story that occasionally the Stooges would come perform as the actors.
I heard this. Apparently, one of the actors who would do this actually became a staple at Fleischerland. Like he got his own show.
Yeah.
Because and the rumor is that this came out of one of the Rotomatronics breaking down pretty irrevocably, and that was of Curly Howard. Curly Howard had broken down, and this guy was originally supposed to just be there as like a guest star. And he just filled in because he had a love for the show.
Yeah.
He totally filled in, and it just worked. And then Max actually saw him performing this and thought, okay, you need your own show. And so they gave him a show elsewhere. And this was Joe Besser, who used to be on the Abbott and Costello show as Stinky. This is little, oh no, get out of the way!
Not so hard.
hard. I'll harm you. And he was not curly, but there was just something that just clicked.
Yeah.
And I always found it ironic that most of the time he used to complain, like, I'll do the show as long as I don't have to get hit. It's a Three Stooges show.
Missing the point, right?
Yeah, what's the point? You're supposed to get hit. It's the Three Stooges. Like, that's stupid. So yeah, that was Joe Besser. And Joe, I guess the show that he wound up in, he performed like 24,000 times or something.
Oh, geez.
Stupid. Like a ridiculous amount of things until he died. Like he lived in the park for like 3 days out of the week. And then he would, go back to his little home right over there in Orlando. He lived in Florida. He had moved out there.
Yeah.
He's like, I've got a good gig. Why give it up? So he was synonymous with the park until when he finally passed away.
Oh, that's so great.
It was crazy. It's like, wow, it's Joe Besser,
Well, and then a little bit later, there's the other big show, which was really the point at which the Rotomatronics took off.
Yeah.
And it was a salute to the president that meant the most.
Yes.
To Max Fleischer. This was, of course, the great President Martin Van Buren.
Yeah. Van Buren.
Yeah, the Great Moments with Van Buren's show.
Man. Great Moments with Martin Van Buren. That was still around.
Yeah.
When I saw that. So that was still there. And there is something delightfully patriotic in going in to this hallowed hall.
Yeah.
It looks, it was built to actually look, it doesn't quite fit in with Brownsville, but it sort of resembles the Capitol building in Philadelphia for some reason.
Yeah,
but
it's weird. But I think some of that has to do, and I think this is why Van Buren meant so much to the Fleischers, was that Van Buren himself was an immigrant.
Yeah, his original language was Dutch, and he spoke Dutch very fluently, and he had a hard time with English.
Yeah,
but it's so bizarre.
Yeah,
that was so well known. I mean, Van Buren.
Yes,
he's known for this. But I guess when they made the attraction, they needed a voice actor. They tried some actor who had played a lot of heavies.
Yeah.
In the 40s. And he played a lot of Nazis and stuff like that, and a lot of Republic serials and stuff at Paramount. He was a survivor of Auschwitz.
Jeez.
He had played chess with Einstein. He had this very extreme look, and he could modify his voice in such an extraordinary way. And even though he spoke very fluently, he had a very dark sense of humor, and his name was Theodore Gottlieb. And otherwise known for those who are from New York as Brother Theodore.
Oh,
and Brother Theodore originally, so Theodore Gottlieb, apparently there's some audio in which, he's doing speeches of Van Buren, but he's speaking with such a strong Hungarian accent that is nowhere near Dutch.
Yeah, I was going to say that's the wrong country.
That's the wrong country entirely. But, Brother Theodore is doing Martin Van Buren. It's not good at all. So they get this guy to play Van Buren, and even though he spoke fluent Dutch, Van Buren did, this actor is synonymous with the voice of Van Buren as Royal Dano.
What?
Royal Dano, who had been in a lot of Westerns. And
is that who that was?
That's the voice of Martin Van Buren in Great Moments with Van Buren. So he's, he's supposed, that speech he gives is a part of a speech where he was talking about the cost of two wars, where he's talking about the Revolution, the War of 1812, because Van Buren lived for a long time.
Yeah.
He actually supported President Abraham Lincoln and spoke very heavily about the abolition of slavery with President Lincoln. But Van Buren really, because of being outspoken and being very much a proponent of equality for all men, is I think why the Fleischer brothers really resonated with him so strongly.
Yeah.
And I love Royal Dano. He's got it does not sound anything like what you imagine Buren to sound like. So, certain danger was foretold from the extension of our territory, the multiplication of states, and the increase of population. Our system was supposed to be adapted only to boundaries comparatively narrow. These have been widened beyond conjecture. The members of our Confederacy are already doubled, and the numbers of our people are incredibly augmented. I mean, it's like, he doesn't.
It still stirs the heart, doesn't it?
It does, though.
Yeah.
It's such a great patriotic piece.
Yeah.
But it really got the Rotomatronics started. It really did. And it just took off from there. I mean, they had some, basic dark ride approach. I mean, they're basing a lot of the rides heavily off of Coney Island dark rides when they were first starting. But the Martin Van Buren Rotomatronic was like really instrumental in getting that part going.
Yeah, and there's speaking of basing the rides off of Coney Island rides, that kind of leads me to the next section, because right off of Brownsville Boulevard, it goes even farther back into the Fleischer history, which is, so you're on Brownsville Boulevard. If you're looking straight ahead, you're seeing that giant ink bottle.
Yeah.
And, right at the hub.
The inkwell itself.
It was so huge that they would sometimes, for a little while, they would put an actor playing Grampy up on the top of it. And he would just like throw what they thought were like blobs of ink, but people misinterpreted that, so they stopped. But if you kind of jut off to the side of Brownsville Avenue, you end up in the section of the park called Old Krakow.
Oh, man.
And, Max Fleischer and Charles Fleischer, the two oldest brothers, were literally born in Krakow, Poland.
Wow.
They themselves were immigrants. And it was designed, it's one of the most ancient cities in Poland, if not the most ancient city in Poland. So it's beautifully designed.
Yeah.
And one of the earliest rides they put in there was a roller coaster. Much like on Coney Island, but with some dark ride elements.
Oh, wow.
And it was called The Return of the Wobble Dragon.
Oh, wow. What?
Do you know the story of the Wobble Dragon?
No, tell me the story here.
So there's a whole bunch of variants, but it's an ancient story from Krakow. Wow. About a dragon that was demanding sacrifices from the town. And there's different variants. Like some are like, well, it was demanding cows. And so people would have to bring the dragon cows from time to time. And eventually someone got fed up and said, I can't give away my last cow. There are other variants that get even heavier where they're giving away daughters.
Okay.
So that's a little uglier.
Yeah.
But the end of the story is always pretty much the same, which is someone gets real fed up and says, we need to do something about this dragon. And so they offer him a sheep or a cow that has been stuffed with sulfur.
Oh, my God. What?
And the dragon eats the sheep or the cow stuffed with sulfur, and it kills them, and that's how they get rid of the Wobble Dragon.
Oh, my God.
So this is a roller coaster based on that legend.
Oh my God!
Where you're flying through kind of dark ride scenes, and you're you're banging by like people with offering up the Fleischers, knowing that offering daughters was probably a bad idea. They stuck with the cow story.
Theme park.
So you see people like offering up their cows and crying, and they're it's those old kind of painted luminous flat dark ride things. And,
fabulous, yeah.
With lights and stuff.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Every once in a while you'll hear a voice saying, I can't give up my last cow.
That's so great.
That's my Polish.
You know who did that voice? The great Paul Frees.
Was that Paul Frees?
That was Paul Frees,
wow.
who would eventually use that exact same voice for Rankin and Bass as the Burgermeister, or whatever the character's name. I can't give up my last cow. It's such a great. It's classic.
Yeah,
I mean, that's on T-shirts still.
Oh yeah,
I can't give up my last cow.
Can't give up my last cow. And then the roller coaster ends with a big swooping dive, and you're suddenly in a room that just reeks of sulfur, and there's a dead dragon lying there. It was an early ride. There was no rotomatronics in it, but how charming.
Well, they did revitalize that. I mean,
did they later?
Oh, they did. I mean, when I went there, they actually did have some rotomatronics where they actually had like the dragon sticking out. What I loved is it was all done in that classic Fleischer style.
Yeah.
Which had gone out of fashion, and they kind of went. There was like this big push in the late 70s of kind of bringing back the old style. Yeah. And I think this was like one of the last big refurbishments that they did.
Yeah.
As kind of a way to kind of mark the anniversary of the park and build it. But when you walk in, when you get into the old Krakow, you're actually looking at the peaks of the Tatra Mountains from Krakow. So and the roller coaster would go in and out of that mountain peak. Yeah. And so you've got the sounds of Polish, traditional Polish singing going on, and every once in a while you could hear the dragon going off. And
so cool.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And you have like Polish farmers and sheep herders. Yeah. Back in the, they kind of discouraged it because of the mess that the sheep would make after a while. So they eventually just had like little rotomatronic, sheep out there. But still, it's this great little corner, this little pocket of the Fleischer's past that's still there. But the dragon was done up, and it was very, very cool because it would like swing around and it would blow this yellow colored smoke at you. It was not sulfur, but it was just like a light behind some steam, but it still was like, oh, they're actually blowing sulfur on us. Oh my God. But it was kind of funny. It wasn't him like blowing fire at you. It was him like holding his throat like he was choking, going, it was like firing at you. It's so bizarre, but it worked. It was funny. It was a roller coaster that made you laugh. That's what I love.
And like what a crazy innovation that is.
So weird. Well, we would be remiss to talk about some of the other lands.
Yeah, I was going to say, why don't we give kind of an overview of some of the lands?
Yeah, so so the main hub of the entire park, when you walk down
giant ink bottle at the end of it.
Yeah, you have the giant ink bottle with the ink well in front of it. Yep. What's interesting about the tour of the ink bottle is that it's kind of this, it's a history. Of the Fleischers, of the early days of Coco the Clown shorts, of the Out of the Inkwell comedies and that kind of stuff. One of the attractions that leads to is one of Kelly's favorites. And I like this one. It's really, really fun, but Kelly's obsessed with this one. You have no idea how many lectures he's had to give me about this. I love it. So it doesn't really bother me, but it's like I'm obsessed about some of these other things too, which we'll talk about in a minute. But Kelly's obsessed with Coco's pants.
Yes, I love Coco's pants.
So talk to me about Coco's pants.
God, it's one of my favorites. So it's in the actual Out of the Inkwell land, which is the land that you get to if you go straight through the giant inkwell. Yeah. It's a little hard to describe. It involves a number of different technologies. Yeah. But what basically happens, and it wraps around that story we were talking about earlier with Charles Fleischer inventing the claw machine.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So what you do is you step into a giant fabricated version of Coco the Clown's pants. and they're kind of split in a V, and you step in and turn around and they zip him up, and these two like big pieces of fiberglass go around you. And so you're standing in the pants, and they're going along a track, and they can rotate some in a sort of chaotic way. And they're moving along this track, and you run into a bunch of rototronics. This is such a great use of them. So you're running into Betty Boop, and you're running into Bimbo, and you're running into the ghost version of Cab Calloway, and you're running into Louis Armstrong.
Just Louis Armstrong?
Just Louis Armstrong. In no particular...
oh, my, there's those pants.
Well, because, they'd had a hit with the short he was in, You Rascal You.
Oh, that's right.
I'll be glad when you're dead, You Rascal You.
That's right. That's right.
And you keep running into them, and they warn you. They're like, don't go this way, Coco, because there's going to be like a giant Edgar Allan Poe style pendulum going across the tracks.
Oh, jeez.
But because you are now Coco, because you're in his pants, you go straight towards it. And what happens is you're actually in an inner car inside the pants.
Right.
And there's a little hook on the back. And so right before you hit the pendulum, one of those claws comes and grabs that hook and lifts you out of Coco's pants, swings you around the track.
Wow.
And drops you in another set of Coco the Clown's pants.
I was too young to understand what was going on. It was like, why am I being lifted?
It's madness. And it's terrifying, too. Because you're about to be killed by, there's at one point there's a buzzsaw. At one point there's a train coming. You're about to die. And suddenly you get lifted into the air unexpectedly, and you're sort of swinging wildly and then dropped into another pair of clown pants.
Jeez. I remember being terrified by the actor, the cast member that was dressed up as Coco the Clown.
Oh, God.
Because, and it wasn't him that scared me. It was the giant ink pen that he had with him. Yeah. Because I thought he was going to stab me with it.
Right.
It was because he was pretending to draw me.
Right.
Like, he would walk around and pretend to be drawing kids.
Yeah.
And they had it was like this little cheap little thing where they used photosensitive paper, and I guess they lined the walls. They had a strobe light that would go off, and Coco would, follow you in there. And you basically stood up against the wall in whatever pose you wanted, and Coco would like draw an outline, and then the flash would go off.
Yeah.
And you were supposed to step away from the wall, and you'd see your shadow up on the wall.
Oh, yeah.
Which was this great, and it's just glow in the dark paper, but it was a great attraction. But when you're like 9 and this 6-foot clown in black and white is aiming this pointy pen at you, it's kind of scary. So,
you know who the original model for Coco was? Because he was rotoscoped. Oh, and it was Dave Fleischer.
Oh, wow.
Dave Fleischer would dress up in the clown outfit, and that was the rotoscope of Coco.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah,
that's awesome. I always wondered why they sold these giant flies. They sold giant flies for some reason out of the inkwell. Like they were like little plush flies.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know why they did that, but for some reason in the out of the inkwell area in Fleischerland, you could buy like anatomically correct plushy flies. I had no idea what that was about. And I guess there's one of the out of the inkwell comedies where Coco fights off a fly that's on the paper that he's being animated on. And I only found that out about a couple of weeks ago while we were researching this episode. It's like, oh, that's why my dad had a fly. Okay. I thought it was a reference to Coco's pants, but no, it was a real, actually, it wasn't an allegory, it was a fly. So bizarre.
And I love that they didn't use any more clever of a name for the ride than Coco's Pants with a big exclamation point.
Yeah, Coco's Pants. So
Come on, Pa, we're going to ride Coco's Pants.
The music was insane, too.
So good.
God, it was this weird mixture of like Dixie and Calliope music. It was so strange. Oh, God.
One of those truly unique, could only be at Fleischerland attractions.
Oh, yeah. I think they actually expanded upon Coco's Pants with another attraction, which, if you kind of take a left turn, it's it's one of those transitional areas between lands.
Yeah.
So if you take a left turn from Coco's Pants, you kind of go through some areas where they have some other smaller rides, and you've got some games, and you wind up in this one section. It looks a little bit like Brownsville, but it's a little bit more like a brownstone suburb.
Yeah.
And this is where I just totally fell in love with Bimbo the dog.
Yeah.
Because they had a cast member there's Bimbo, and I got a big hug, and it was very sweet. It was like, oh, and my dad bought me a pair of Bimbo ears, which are the ones we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
But this is like one of the classics. This like anybody who's into Fleischerland will go, I remember this. This is the big one.
Yeah.
Which is Bimbo's Initiation. Mm-hmm. And it's based off of the cartoon. And Bimbo's Initiation, for those who don't know, Bimbo the dog is literally just walking down the street and gets pulled down a manhole by all these crazy, like, they're almost like Freemasons. They're making fun of the Freemasons.
Yeah.
Or at least the Odd Fellows.
Yeah.
You want to be a member? Want to be a member? No. And all of a sudden he goes through this initiation of this series of tortures, and the ride is not really a ride. It's a walkthrough exhibit where you actually encounter this fun house of going from room to room with, slides that go on forever. You had doors that you would have to open up 7 versions that get smaller and smaller, and you had to squeeze through them. And it was very, very faithful to the cartoon. And I love that one because that was the place where mom and dad would drop kids off to like, we're going to go get a hot dog. You go into Bimbo's Initiate. Go play. Yeah. And it's the only place in the park where you get to see Betty Boop with long doggy ears.
Right, because she originally was a dog.
Right, she was originally a dog as a girlfriend for Bimbo, and it's the only place where you can see. And she's still like there's a picture up on the wall, and it comes to life. They did this kind of rear projection thing with like an old film camera.
I love how they do that. They did that in a bunch of attractions. It was kind of one of their shticks, and it's so great.
It's cute. You just kind of like you just go, it's a signature illusion for this park.
Yeah,
but yeah, she's got the long ears and. You know, you want to be a member? Want to be a member? It's so great. You know, and everybody had like the shirts, want to be a member, want to be a member.
Oh, I know.
And my favorite, they actually made hats with the candle on the top.
Oh, wow.
With a stupid little candle on the top with like a little flame, and it's made out of felt, and you wiggle it and stuff like that.
Oh, that's so great.
You could buy the plunger with the little string coming out the top. It was so great. But strangely enough, as madcap as Bimbo's initiation attraction was, it was a nice way for parents to kind of calm down before you get to, it's arguably one of the most popular areas because it lasted from the beginning all the way to the very end, which is Sweet Haven.
Yeah.
And so this is where
Popeye and olive oil, castor oil.
They kind of they kind of made it look like 1850s New England,
right?
Like a port town,
right?
And you had the fish, and you know just big things of fish hanging everywhere.
Yeah.
You had an actor dressed up as Wimpy.
Yeah,
you know, glad you play you Tuesday. They had Wimpy burgers.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Well, actually, it wasn't Wimpy burgers. The Wimpy burger was one of the burgers you get there. It was actually Rough House's hamburgers.
Right.
And you'd go in, and there'd be Rough House. You know, the chef would be dressed up as Rough House making hamburgers for you. And then if Wimpy came in, I remember the guy came in with Wimpy. He tried to take my burger. I got so mad. I'm like, you give me that back, you know, and it was so great. But yeah, you get lunch at, so I always made sure that we go to Wimpy Burger, you know, the Rough House burgers.
Well, and the neat thing about Sweet Haven is it served as a sort of secondary hub for the whole park.
Kind of, yeah.
Because, you know, you could go down Brownsville and get to the main hub and sort of split or off in a bunch of different directions. But you could also go to Sweet Haven and get on a boat.
Right. It was Popeye's Coast Guard tugboat.
Yeah.
Which was kind of a transformer. It would be suddenly become an airplane in the cartoons.
Right.
It had like little references to that. And the reason they expanded upon it, because Max Fleischer was always about innovation, but he actually was being asked by kids like, well, okay, this is, you know, they had originally just made it as a lake.
Yeah.
And there would be all these trees around. They didn't know what to do with the rest of the outskirts of the lake. And then fans of the park would come up to, you know, to Max very early on and say, where does Popeye go in his tugboat?
Yeah.
And so they said, well, let's expand upon that. So they made Popeye's Seven Seas, in which you would hop in the tugboat and it would take you to these different rides and attraction areas based off of the different locations from the Popeye cartoon. So you go to the Middle East, or you go to China, or you go to the South Seas, and, you know, all these different places.
Yeah.
And like there was a luau area that was kind of like, it was like a barbecue pit, but it was all Hawaiian food.
Yeah.
And they had the Betty Boop there is actually in a hula skirt, greeting you, which is where Popeye first premiered, you know, in his cartoon, was in a Betty Boop cartoon. Yeah. Then you could actually go on the Alibaba and his 40 Thieves ride. Yeah. Which was like a minecart ride, which I just... so good, and they colored everything like the movies. Yeah. The only way to get in it is everybody in the car had to say "Open Sesame" to get into the ride.
Oh, that's so neat.
So good. I mean, I love the fact also, like right next to it, they actually had a game where you were like you were bowling. It was like 9 pins. Yeah. But it was Popeye bowling bad guys, but like the ball was painted like Popeye. It was so bizarre. And you could get spinach salads. Yep. You know, like that kind of, it was just so great. Cream spinach. Right. All that kind of stuff. For some, like, I don't know who did it. I don't know who sourced this, but somebody cornered the market on corncob pipes to sell at Fleischerland, because they sold so many sailor hats and corncob pipes were so big. It was so huge. Every kid wanted them. Yeah. Every kid wanted one. They were everywhere. I mean, they actually tried, because they were trying their hand at television. They actually tried a very brief and kind of a failed attempt at doing a live action Popeye with Buddy Ebsen as Popeye. Huh. And that was kind of like, some people think that like that was the whole impetus for the hat and the corncob pipe.
Right.
And there was a rendition done by Bobby V of the Popeye the Sailor Man theme
the
that
main
was released.
theme. Yeah.
But it just didn't really click. It was Buddy Epson was kind of like this kind of down homey pop. It just didn't quite work for people.
Yeah, I mean,
but some people have a soft spot for it.
The dancing style's right. Like that's Buddy Epson's dancing style is perfect for that.
But it just wasn't quite right. Like I actually believe Royal Dano before I believe Buddy Epson.
I remember like Sweet Haven. It was just such a beautiful environmental piece. Like you were just walking through it. You felt like you were in a cartoon. Like there was a real richness and depth to the land. There was stuff going on in all the windows. Every once in a while, you'd see someone walking around with like a sweet pea in their arms.
Yeah.
You know,
all the stuffed sweet peas they used to make wind-up sweet peas, which were really, really fun.
Yeah, and I love that thing that they used to do with kids where like they would go up and test their strength against Bluto. And then they'd go up and like Bluto would bend an iron bar, and then the kid would bend the iron bar, and
it's just rubber hose.
Just a rubber hose.
Who cares?
They drive Bluto crazy.
It was so good. Well, the Bluto's bumper boats.
Yeah.
It's a little, it's. This was like you obviously don't want people actually beating each other up, because I mean that was kind of like the staple of the Three Stooges movies, but also the Popeye cartoons was this kind of violent resolution of stuff, like this catharsis. Like Fleischer, even though he was trying very hard to make entertainment for families, I mean very much. I mean, especially when you go to like the kiddie area, which was Lilliput.
Yep.
The cold Gulliver's Travels.
Yeah.
It's fine, but it's a lot of kiddie rides, and you're kind of like, okay, it's cute.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was a gorgeous film. I mean, Gulliver's Travels is a monumental film.
Yeah.
But it just didn't quite, get it. But for some reason, it really resonated of catharsis. People were okay with catharsis as long as it was the safety of the park.
Yeah.
And Bluto's bumper boats were great.
Yeah.
Because, you were in this giant, I think it was only like 2 or 3 feet deep.
Yeah.
So like if there was a mishap, you could stand up.
Right.
But they were like these boats that looked like these rundown tugboats. These big rope bumpers on the sides. And and they had like a little smokestack sticking out the back. And you're like steering these things with this little ship's wheel. And you're trundling around, bumping into each other. And that one little area, where you could steer into it was like a little cave. It was like a big U-turn, and everybody would get caught up. So they eventually blocked that off, and they put pirate treasure in there instead, because kids would actually get jammed in there. And then no one could ever get in there because everybody was like cramming up, because everybody wanted to go in the pirate cave.
Yeah.
But Bluto's bumper boats was just like, that's awesome.
Oh yeah,
that was so good.
Yeah.
And then there was the play area, which was Goon Island.
Yes. Yeah.
Goon Island. Talk to me about Goon Island.
So weird.
It really was.
Because the goons were so strange. And I think they were really smart not to have people dressed as the goons, like directly interacting with young kids, because I think it would have been too terrifying.
Well, they cottoned it by having the Jeep everywhere.
I
mean, the Jeep was very definitely, a character. It was kind of, it's Popeye's pet. Basically, the Jeep.
Yeah.
So you could definitely have, Jeep stuffies and people loved the Jeep. It was really, really sweet.
Yeah.
But having the goons were always like hinted that they were there. And
right.
you see pictures of like Alice and stuff, but you never actually had them there. Like there was a legend.
Yeah.
At one time, there was a rotomatronic of Alice the Goon.
Oh,
and I think it was only there for like a couple of weeks. And I remember seeing this thing on YouTube, which they actually showed this footage. Somebody had snuck in a camera right on opening. It was there for opening day, but then it was suddenly gone. And for some reason, the effect didn't work.
Yeah.
So there are like whole fan clubs about Alice the Goon, rotomatronic, of how cool that was. They make Alice the Goon. And it supposedly was just too scary, just having this, 7.5 foot tall goon.
Yeah, even though Alice is the sweet one. But. This month at Boardwalk Times, we're looking at the idea of Disney using itself as an IP. We're exploring what the new Avengers attraction means for California adventure. I took a deep dive beyond the hype into what Disneyland Forward is really about, and also what it isn't. And we spend some time discussing tips for accessible travel in the theme parks. Come check it all out at boardwalktimes.net. Well, so you were talking about catharsis a little earlier, and I wanted to talk about the one kind of spooky ride at Fleischerland, which was in the Harlem Corners area of the park, and that would be the Syncopated Shades Club.
I love the Harlem area. I loved it so much.
It's so great, and just I love that they had actual jazz clubs there.
Louis Armstrong himself used to perform there.
That's right. Yeah. And I love that, you get on that ride and Cab Calloway is the voice in your ears.
Yep.
And he's guiding you through spooky optical illusions and anthropomorphized objects that are kind of trying to scare you.
There's all these references to a lot of some of Ub Iwerk's like spookier cartoons that he made for Fleischer.
That's right. Yeah.
The Mummy Dance and all these other ones. But yeah, it's this great pastiche of all the creepy stuff that Fleischer did in their cartoons.
Yeah, and there seems to be a through line, though it's never super straightforward, but there seems to be a through line that you're trying to find Minnie. You're trying to find Minnie the Moocher.
Right.
In it. And I love that towards the end of the ride, you realize that Minnie is just Betty Boop again. And there's that great thing where you get towards the end of the ride and you see Betty literally like tied up to a giant gong.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, oh, my God, we got to free Betty. And you kind of bumps the gong and it spins. Then the next thing you see, Betty's free. And that's sort of the end of the ride. But to get there, you've seen all of these ghosts. You've gone through graveyards.
And it's a long ride. It's
really
like 11
long.
Minutes and you're floating in the water the whole time. One of my favorite effects is one that people always talk about. It blew me away. There's a section which you kind of reach these ice caves.
Yeah.
And like the voice, like the ghost transforms into this walrus. And as you're floating through, there's this moment where the ice cakes are starting to swim around you as the music is building up. And this giant ice skull face just like lifts up. It's like a big cup.
Yeah.
That would come out of the water and swallow the boat.
Yeah.
So it's perfectly timed. So the boat comes through as this cup comes around, and then it would just cycle through.
Yeah.
But it was this great moment where you really felt like this dripping water on you. You're like, whoa, we're getting swallowed. And then it becomes this drop down. It's this lovely little moment. It's just, it's such a staple.
Yeah.
They once tried adding live actors to it for that extra thrill, but it didn't quite work out because people would be hitting the actors and stuff. Nobody really wanted that.
It's not cool. Like you want to go through there and you just want you and your pal Cab.
Yeah. The Harlem Corners. It's another transition because it's like this beautiful, like the way that the park was laid out was almost like this big circle.
Yeah.
Of taking you through. I mean, you could go to, like, there were spokes that you could go out to, but it was a big circle.
Yeah.
And this takes us to the much more fast-paced and a lot more, one would say there's hope involved, but it's a very big departure from all of the funny cartoon stuff that a lot of the Fleischer, like Popeye and Betty Boop, which was Metropolis.
Oh, yeah. And speaking of transitions, one of the most interesting things that I think this park ever did was they actually built a transition that took you in from one land and let you out in a different one. And this leads into Metropolis because, of course, we're talking about the Coco's Earth Control attraction.
Right.
Where
where
it's like, what a fascinating thing. And it's based on the brilliant early Coco short where I think it's Coco and Fitz.
Oh, yeah.
And Coco discovers that there's a place where you can go where Earth is controlled from, like tides and weather and geological movements and stuff like that. And so you came in, for those who didn't get to experience this, it was wonderful. You would come and sit in this sort of round room all facing the middle, and there'd be screens above you and below you and kind of around the periphery. it was as if you were in a flying saucer.
Oh, wow.
And your saucer sort of ostensibly launches. And that's what the screens are for. So you can see yourself going up and you can see yourself going down. I think the chairs vibrated a little.
Right.
And then they go up and they dock with Coco's Earth control. And so you can see Coco on the screens around you and what he's doing, and you're docked to his machine. And every time he changes something on the Earth, you spin a little. So the big circular thing you're in sort of spins.
Huh.
And it's this really weird effect because he's doing these Earth-changing things and you're kind of moving with it.
That's so cool.
And towards the end, a big button rises up out of the middle of the floor, and it says, "Don't touch this or the world will stop working." And it literally rises up physically in the middle of the floor. It's the only thing you've seen so far that's not animation. And then you see on the screens around it, Fitz trying to get to the button.
Oh, jeez.
And then things start going crazy. Coco's trying to stop him. You're spinning. Lights are going on and off. And all of a sudden, the lights come on, and there's a rototronic Fitz pressing the button.
Oh, jeez. That's so wrong.
It's so great. And then it's just chaos. Like you're seeing earthquakes on the screens. You're spinning like crazy. Lights are going on, off and on. Coco is like freaking out on the screens above and below you. And all of the sudden you see this blue streak start circling the screens around the periphery, and you start to slow down your spinning. And things start to reverse, and you start seeing on the screens all of the earthquakes reversing so that everything's fine.
Oh,
and all
so
of the
cool.
giant waves are rolling back into the sea.
Oh, man.
And you start to realize that it's Superman turning back time. And you just hear this voice going, "Oh, no, you don't, little fella."
And nice crossover. That's so cool.
And at the end, Superman has reversed everything that Coco and Fitz have done. Well, most of the screens were in black and white because that's what the original cartoon was. But,
sure.
But at the end, they're suddenly in color, and you just hear, "Welcome to Metropolis."
Nice.
And a door opens on the other side, and you walk out from the inkwell area into Metropolis. I just think that's brilliant. It's chaos like early Fleischer, and it's inspiring like later Fleischer.
Oh, yeah. And because you could just choose to walk. I remember that ride. It was like,
yeah, of course you could.
And you don't get it until you ride it, and then it becomes this thing of like, I know it's coming.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
But when you first go through, it's like, what am I looking at
what
here?
The heck's
What is
happening?
going on? What is this? And when suddenly Superman pops up, you're like, oh, okay, this is great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, Max Fleischer, within a year of the publication of Superman comics, the brothers were approached by the owners of Superman to produce a animated feature.
Yeah.
And it was originally called The Mad Doctor. Not The Mad Doctor, it was The Mad Scientist. Was the very first
Mad Scientist, yeah.
And it's about, gravity of this mad scientist has this giant magnet that shoots meteors at Metropolis. And it was beautiful, beautifully done. Of course, like the classics, like the Mechanical Monsters and the Frozen Giant, those are just amazing.
Yeah.
There was a rough period during World War II where everybody was suffering from budgetary constraints. And you can definitely see it in the animated Superman shorts. Just the quality kind of goes down a little bit.
Yeah.
But, I mean, everybody was going through that at this time.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
And Metropolis didn't actually open with the original park.
Yeah, that's right. It came in a number of years later.
A couple of years later, it was actually added in there. Strangely enough, one of the designers who was instrumental in designing the park started off as an in-betweener on Superman. Like he wasn't like a main animator. He would just fill in the, when you have animation, you have what are called key poses, which are like these main poses of animated characters. And they do these fill-ins to kind of fill in the gaps so that it smooths out the animation. Those are called in-betweens. And that's what this guy did. His name was Jacob Kurtzberg. And he was from New York. He was another Brownsville resident. And he started as an in-betweener, and then he kind of got tired of working at the Fleischer Studios for a while. He was like, I'm going to go off and try other things. I've got he was always ambitious.
Yeah.
And he wound up working with another fellow named Joe Simon. And the two of them tried their hand at this new medium that had grown in the 30s called comic books.
Yeah.
Started off by a guy, another Max.
Yeah.
Which was a guy named Max Gaines. He started out Famous Funnies, and that became comic books as we know it.
Yeah.
But he and Simon, Kurtzberg and Simon, well, I should say Kurtzberg changed his name to Jack Kirby. And Jack, these guys were really fast. They worked for anybody for hire. They became like their own independent comic book world.
Yeah.
And very bold style, very, very, very quick. And I think it was the need for speed in an animation house that made Kirby so fast and so accurate.
Yeah.
And he and Fleischer were not enemies. They did not have a big falling out. He just wanted to try something else.
Right.
But who he did have a falling out with was another entrepreneur and another auteur. It was a guy named Stanley Lieber.
Yeah.
And Stanley was working at a place called Atlas Comics, and they were doing, the standard wartime comics, characters like Captain America and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And then in the 50s, there was the big horror comic craze. So everybody tried their hand at horror comics and romance comics.
Yeah.
And superheroes were very, very out of fashion. And it wasn't until Lieber and Lee started playing around with these ideas of new characters. So we're talking 1962, 1963. They start playing with these ideas.
Yeah.
And they launch the Atlas Comics had become Marvel Comics. And Stan and Jack put out this comic called The Fantastic Four. And it was a great comic book. It was like fabulous superhero arrangement. I love those old Fantastic Four comics. They really resonated, but they lose everything the minute Jack walks away because Stan was too much of a blowhard, and too much of it's all me, baby. Yeah. So he just kind of ruined the whole thing. I mean, imagine the kind of stuff we would have had if Jack had stayed with Marvel.
Oh, yeah.
But all we get was like the Fantastic Four, and then Marvel just kind of drops off.
Yeah, they kind of disappear.
Yeah, it's like they had some runs of some stuff. I mean, they had a character called Spider-Man. It was done by a guy named Steve Ditko. Yeah. But you didn't have many other characters. It was just didn't quite wit. And getting so much in a huff, Jack leaves and runs into Max Fleischer. Yeah. And you want a job? So he becomes a concept artist at the Fleischer theme park division, and he starts toying around. He's like, well, your artwork's very popular at Marvel. What can you do with the stuff from DC? Because we own Superman. Yeah. And he starts designing Metropolis, but in that really, he's still paying homage to those older things that he used to work, because he was there on those older Superman cartoons. But now he's got this big, bold style that's very distinctive to Jack Kirby. And he builds Metropolis, and everything's done in forced perspective with these huge buildings that totally obscure, massive. And the Superman ride has the worst line ever, because it takes forever to get on this thing.
Yeah, it really does.
But it's amazing because it gives you the illusion of flight. It's this great suspended thing where you're all kind of standing there, but you're kind of flying with Superman through these adventures, and you get attacked by the giant fanged dinosaur that has popped out of the ice, and you have the mechanical monsters trying to grab you. Yeah. And it's like this mix between a roller coaster and a dark ride, and it is so much fun.
Yeah, just such a clever mesh of textures and different speeds that you're going in, and yeah,
and he became a staple for the designs all the way up to the closing of the park, because he became the workhorse for the Fleischers of we're gonna I think he actually did a couple of the lands for Popeye's Seven Seas too. So he had made these these more elaborate and much more, because his big thing was exploring different cultures and different religions in some very unique ways, and exploring esotericism. He was an odd duck, but he was very, very prolific.
Yeah.
And there's whole people devoted to galleries of Jack Kirby work, especially from his theme park days.
Yeah.
It's like, again, I'd love to have seen more of his work in comics, but he just kind of settled in because he could work fast enough. And then when the park closed, he was one of those few people that didn't just bank on the theme park. He went back to comics.
Oh, interesting.
And he started drawing DC. He was drawing, Batman and Superman and all this. But it's like this old workhorse. Yeah, Jack Kirby, I'm going to draw comics. Forget this. Forget Marvel. I'm going to go out and do this. I'm going to do some DC. And he was also instrumental because of his connections with Fleischer and the comic book world. They used him very heavily to bring in the other staples of these other DC characters in the 70s.
Yeah.
Because you had the Justice League of America.
Right.
But it was like this really bad stunt show with boats and water skis for some reason. And it rough. That was a low point. And I think that's when they had a management transition due to budgetary constraints in the mid-70s.
The thing I love about his Metropolis design, I think it's so great, is that as someone who's a static artist, he really had a sense of that things needed to be in motion.
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Yeah, and as soon as you walk into Metropolis, like, everything's moving. Mm-hmm. Like there's things on top of buildings that are spinning. There's there's vehicles, some that you can ride on, some that are just for show.
I love the elevated freeway that goes over. It's just these cars that are going back and forth and they look like they're growing because they're getting closer.
Yeah.
It's such a great detail that they threw in there.
Yeah. And it feels like that kind of optimistic progress that you want to see in a future land.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It was all about, progression. Like it's the world. It's kind of like this world of tomorrow, this man of tomorrow approach of Superman from Krypton, giving us humans this view into what life could be, through the lens of Superman. Like this is the world of Superman and his friends. You've got Batman, you've got Wonder Woman, you've got Hawkman, you've got Our Man.
I think so much of this is an immigrant story. And
it totally is.
So we're talking about the Fleischers who are immigrants, and then we're talking about Superman who is created by two immigrants. Mm-hmm. Also two Jewish immigrants, just like the Fleischers. And Superman as a character himself who is an immigrant.
Oh yeah.
And I think it wraps together beautifully in that way.
Absolutely. And the hard part is, so by the time I got there, I was there that final year. Yeah. I think that's where I noticed a lot of the fading and the kind of it was kind of sad, like going to Metropolis as a 9-year-old kind of going, what's a shame. I still loved it, because I loved all the DC characters. I read Justice Society so much. It was I love the Spectre. I love Wildcat, all these great characters. Yeah. And they were all there. It was like, they're totally represented. Yeah. It was great. But everything was just a little faded in the Florida sun, and everything was definitely starting to show weathering from the water. Yeah. The water logging. I'm not sure when things started falling apart for the park. Mm-hmm. But the rumor is that it had something to do with the two brothers. Yeah. They had some sort of rift, and to this day, no one really knows exactly what it was about.
Yeah, it seems that Max and Dave, who were the primary creators, seem to just always be at odds for their whole careers. And Max was kind of a mastermind in a lot of ways, and he was the inventor and he was the producer, and Dave was the funny guy. Yeah. And Dave was the one who was on the floor with the animators, and they didn't think they were doing the same job ever. Yeah. And so they just fought, and as I understand it, Max died in the 60s, I want to say. Dave Fleischer died in 79. Yeah. And, the kind of the force of will of those two men were sort of keeping things together in spite of their differences. Mm-hmm. By the time it ended up being the estates of those two men, it was all over.
Fleischer died in 1972. Max Fleischer, and his brother in 1979. Yeah. So the 70s became the real point of contention because it was like one person going before the other. Yeah. And you could definitely see where the priorities are.
Yeah.
You know,
for sure. And by the time they were both gone, the families were at odds. There was no holding it together anymore.
Yeah.
And the industry that they had started with was a different industry.
Oh, yeah.
They certainly were a powerful entertainment company, but not as powerful.
Well, this leads to one last little Brownsville resident who was kind of sowing his oats and kind of catching up and kind of showing the world of what was possible. But you can definitely see his love for the Fleischer's works. But he was definitely rebelling against like the Warner Brothers staple and all these other kind of schmaltzy cartoons that were coming out from all of his competitors. And his name was Ralph Bakshi.
Yeah.
He grew up in Brownsville, New York, the same thing.
He's really the spiritual successor of the Fleischer's animation.
He kind of is. And it's a real shame that that the theme park, I think if the theme park had survived long enough, we actually would have seen Bakshi and some of his properties maybe would have, I would love to fantasize like a world in which Bakshi actually starts like working with the Fleischer estates and like, you know, saying, I could totally fix this up for you, be totally great. We'll make it great. You know, we'll bring Frank Frazetta in here. We'll do a fire and ice ride. You know, it'll be great. But Bakshi, you know, had a love for Fleischerland.
Yeah.
Because I think he loved the heart that went into that place.
Yeah.
And it had a tremendous heart. And I think that's the thing that we can take away from Fleischerland is that the place was built with a tremendous amount of imagination and heart behind it.
Yeah.
That I don't think anybody else really could have managed. I really don't.
There's a vision there that is unlike anybody else's vision, and that's why they were so huge. That's why people loved them so. It was because the Fleischers never talked down to their audience. The Fleischers were willing to show them the strangest things that came out of their heads.
Massive risk takers. Oh my God. Massive risk takers. It's one of those American staples that people they still talk about it. I mean, it's been gone now for almost 40 years.
Yeah.
And yet, you know, because it closed October 15th, 1983, and it has been gone ever since. And yet, you know, poor little Heather O'Rourke, you know, being stuck at the gate. I feel that way. It's like people have talked about reviving it. Like fans are like, we got to buy it, you know. But people get together for these conventions and people cosplay. It's real, and we're talking about it now, which is great.
Yeah. And it's sweet, and its time has passed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so speaking of time,
yes,
it's the time of our show in which we no longer give the lowdown. It's time to give the plus up.
But we may have done things a little bit in reverse this time because in many ways the entire episode was the plus up.
Yes, indeed. So we are back to the normal reality. So for those who've been listening and going, what on earth are you two talking about?
Yeah, God bless you for sticking with us.
Yeah, well, if you made it this far, you're awesome.
So we want to say a couple of things about this. This was an idea that popped out when Pete and I went to Disneyland recently and just started musing on the idea of what would it be like if the Fleischers had won the animation and made a theme park like that. And we started looking for ways that might happen and what that might look like.
Yeah, we're wandering around like Adventureland going, what would be the equivalent?
Yes.
You know, like this would be this, you know. We would just be on a ride and all of a sudden one of us would lean over to the other and go like, yeah, this ride is going to be Betty Boop. And
what I think is kind of interesting about this is that except for the main premise, most everything we said was true.
Absolutely.
In fact, Disney did get that deal.
He did for Technicolor. Yep.
And he held on to it for a little over 3 years, where nobody else could use 3-strip Technicolor.
Not even live action films.
Not even live action films, and it knocked Fleischer back several steps, and the Hays Code did come into play in the 30s, and it was unfairly targeted towards Jewish filmmakers, and it hurt the Fleischers a great deal. Yep,
absolutely. And Ub Iwerks was one of also the victims, because when he left Disney Studios, he went to work at MGM, and some of his cartoons were featuring very racy jokes.
Yeah.
And the Hayes office was actually coming down on him as well.
Yeah.
And eventually he did actually wind up working with Walt again later on.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Also, Charles Fleischer did, in fact, invent the coin-operated claw machine. That's true. And that's the story about them all being broken before he was arrested is absolutely true.
Yep.
But, there's a story I want to tell at the end of this that maybe pulls this all together in a way. Mm-hmm. Richard Fleischer, Max's son, truly was a film director. And the film that really made his name was a movie he made with Walt Disney called 20,000 Leagues Beneath the Sea.
Yep.
It was a huge hit. Walt was really taking a risk with Fleischer, who he only had one film to his name before that. Mm-hmm. He was relatively inexperienced for a film that was really, really important for Disney at that point financially. Walt gave Richard the job. Walt certainly knew who Richard's father was. Mm-hmm. They had been very, very tight competitors for a very long time. But by that point, Max had retired.
Yeah.
And the Fleischer Studios had been bought out by Paramount, right?
Yeah, by Paramount. Yep.
And his career had ended really prematurely.
Yeah.
And Richard Fleischer came up to Walt Disney and said, "Hey, I think you know who my dad is. He just was wondering if he could come see the studio someday." And Walt said to Richard Fleischer, "Yeah, of course. Have him come on this day, and I'll show him around the studio. I'll show Max Fleischer around." And what Walt Disney did was he, in the intervening time, went and found every single animator that he could find that previously had worked for the Fleischer Studios and flew them into Burbank. So that when Max showed up, he had a reunion with his entire animation staff. It was a beautiful gesture. Mm-hmm. It really, to me, says, I mean, there's good things about Walt, there's bad things about Walt, but he could be very generous, and it is, to my mind, a very sweet way to pay homage to the person who was probably his greatest competitor.
Absolutely. I mean, and Max actually acknowledged that when Richard asked his father, I don't want to seem disloyal to you while I'm working on 20,000 Leagues. And Max basically looked at him. This was before the reunion. And he said, "You must absolutely take this job."
Yeah.
And later on, he called up Walt and he says, "I just want to let you know you've got great taste in directors." So, yeah. I mean, Kelly and I were at Disneyland and we came up with this idea, and we've been ulcerating to do this particular show.
Yeah.
And we want to thank you guys for coming along with us with this little imaginary ride into what if Walt had not made Disneyland, and what if Max Fleischer had.
Yeah.
So.
And next episode, we'll be back to something a little more real.
Yes, indeed. So in the meantime, I'm Peter Overstreet.
And I'm Kelly McCubbin.
And you're listening to
The Lowdown on the Plus Up. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Lowdown on the Plus Up. If you have, please tell your friends where you found us. And if you haven't, we can pretend this never happened and need not speak of it again. For a lot more thoughts on theme parks and related stuff, check out my writing for Boardwalk Times at boardwalktimes.net. Feel free to reach out to Pete and I on our Lowdown on the Plus Up Facebook group, or send us a message directly at comments@lowdown-plus-up.com. We really want to hear about how you'd plus these attractions up and read some of your ideas on the show. Our theme music is Goblin, Tinker, Soldier, Spy by Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.com. We'll have a new episode out real soon. Why? Because we like you.
be a member?
No.